Imagine a pristine morning as the first light of dawn touches the summits of the Manhattan skyscrapers, where the pulse of human civilization is operating like a perfect mechanical engine at a speed of over 1,600 kilometers per hour. A staggering figure that the human senses have never been keen enough to perceive the presence of. We are standing on a giant spacecraft made of rock and iron, a never-tiring entity dancing in the pitch-black void. But what would happen if this eternal machine suddenly jerked to a halt in a single breath? Just 5 seconds of stillness to shatter every law of the order of all things. When that rotation stops, a rebellion of physics will break out in the form of an invisible ghost named inertia, turning the once gentle atmosphere into Mach 1.3 aerodynamic blades that tear apart all steel and concrete structures, flinging every creation of civilization into an aimless journey eastward like worthless fragments in a devastating storm. In that fateful moment, the oceans those gentle monsters once held captive by centrifugal force will rise like water walls kilometers high, swallowing continents and erasing all memory of boundaries in a thunderous roar that shakes the very core of the planet. Yet, amidst the terrifying chaos of crumbling towers and surging tsunamis, there is still a strange stillness in the laws of the universe, a profound reminder of the fragility of life. When faced with the cogwheels of celestial mechanics, those 5 seconds are not just a catastrophe. They are a deep dialogue between stone and water, between movement and standing still, leading us on a journey deep into whether this blue entity will heal itself or vanish forever into the darkness. Welcome to the most dramatic vision that the human intellect has ever dared to touch. A world without its rhythm of rotation, where every beginning must learn to start again from the ashes of stillness. To truly comprehend the sheer, unbridled violence of these 5 seconds, we must first confront the invisible titan that has quietly governed every movement of our lives since the very moment of our birth. The immutable, unforgiving law of inertia. This fundamental principle of physics dictates that an object in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by a superior external force. And for 4.5 billion years, every single atom on this blue marble, from the smallest grain of silicate sand to the deepest ancient roots of the coastal redwoods, has been tethered to a frantic, relentless rotation that we simply call home. When the Earth abruptly stops, that ancient celestial tether snaps with a cosmic resonance. But the momentum itself does not simply vanish into the void. Instead, it is redirected with the concentrated fury of 1,000 suns against the very surface that once gave it stability and life. At the equator, where the planet's curvature is most pronounced and its rotational velocity reaches a staggering 1,600 kilometers per hour, the land beneath your feet may have ceased its eternal rhythmic dance. Yet everything not bolted to the primordial bedrock, the very air you breathe, the towering glass cathedrals of Manhattan, and the dark, rich soil of the Central Plains remains possessed by a phantom velocity that utterly defies human comprehension. This is not merely a gust of wind. It is a supersonic sledgehammer of kinetic energy, a Mach 1.3 wall of atmospheric pressure that transforms the invisible oxygen around us into a physical force of absolute, total erasure, acting as a celestial scythe, harvesting the fruits of 100 centuries of human labor. Within the first 2 seconds, the structural integrity of modern engineering, our proud monuments of glass, steel, and collective hubris, is revealed as a fragile, heartbreaking illusion. As skyscrapers are not simply blown over like trees in a storm, but are literally disintegrated into a horizontal blizzard of jagged shrapnel and pulverized concrete dust that coats the world in a gray, silent shroud. Imagine the sheer mechanical stress as the friction between the stationary crust and the racing atmosphere generates a thermal pulse so intense it rivals the heat of a re-entering spacecraft. A searing wave of energy that begins to bake the ruins of our cities into twisted caricatures of their former selves, melting the very asphalt and twisting the iron skeletons of our world into unrecognizable shapes. The energy released in this sudden, violent deceleration is equivalent to the simultaneous detonation of thousands of strategic nuclear warheads. Yet it carries no searing radiation, only the raw, cold, and calculated fury of a planet's stolen momentum being turned against its own children in a final, tragic embrace. Think of a passenger in a luxury car hitting a reinforced brick wall at highway speeds. Now, expand that image until the passenger is the entire human race, and the wall is the very air itself, suddenly hardened into a barrier of diamond-like resistance. As the winds scream across the vast, desolate continents, they carry with them the pulverized remains of cities, the echoes of forgotten forests, and the weight of history itself, moving so fast that the resulting friction begins to ignite the very sky, turning our protective atmosphere into a glowing shroud of incandescent plasma that incinerates everything in its path before it even hits the ground. As we move toward the silent, frozen poles, the violence begins to taper into a haunting, rhythmic destruction, where the velocity of the standstill decreases in a cruel mathematical curve. But the shock of the transition remains a universal death sentence for anything not anchored to the ancient, unyielding bedrock of the world. This is the terrifying crystalline moment when physics stops being a set of dry, dusty equations in a forgotten textbook and becomes the ultimate cold architect of our extinction. A profound and final reminder that our entire existence has always been a mere passenger on a spinning wheel whose brakes we were never meant to touch, let alone feel. Even as the terrible silence falls over the ruins, the echoes of this kinetic collapse will continue to ripple through the planet's crust, triggering a cascade of geological failures and deep-seated tremors that will reshape the face of the Earth forever, proving that in the grand, indifferent game of celestial mechanics, gravity and motion always have the final, unanswerable word. Think of the billions of tons of seawater, no longer held at the equator by the ghost of centrifugal force, beginning their slow, inevitable migration toward the North and South poles, creating a new geography of drowning empires and rising seabeds. A transformation that turns our maps into fiction and our borders into forgotten lines beneath a new, restless ocean. The atmosphere, still screaming at supersonic speeds, will begin to strip the very topsoil from the Earth, revealing the skeletal remains of the planet's crust, a barren landscape that resembles the moon more than the garden we once inhabited. While the friction generated at the boundary of the standstill heats the air to temperatures that melt lead, creating a global oven that cooks the remnants of our civilization into a layer of ash and glass. We are witnessing the undoing of the Holocene, the unraveling of the delicate threads that allowed life to flourish in the first place. As the magnetic field, that invisible shield generated by the spinning iron heart of our world, begins to waver and flicker, exposing the wounded surface to the relentless, searing breath of the solar wind. Deep within the Earth, the sudden halt sends shock waves through the mantle, causing the liquid outer core to slosh violently against the solid inner core. A subterranean tsunami of molten metal that disrupts the planet's very foundation and prepares the way for a volcanic awakening of apocalyptic proportions. Every mountain range is now a speed bump. Every ocean is a weapon. And every cloud is a witness to the absolute power of kinetic energy unleashed without restraint. In the deep oceans, the shock wave of the Standstill travels through the water column like a silent underwater hammer, crushing submarines and shattering the delicate ecosystems of the abyss, while the surface waters are whipped into a frenzy of white foam and towering walls of salt. The very rotation that once protected us by creating the Coriolis effect now abandons us, leaving the weather patterns to collapse into a singular, global storm that possesses no center and no mercy. A chaotic vortex that redefines the meaning of catastrophe. It is a masterpiece of destruction, a silent symphony of chaos played out on a planetary stage, where the laws we once studied in quiet classrooms now dictate the terms of our disappearance. In this 5-second window, time itself seems to stretch into an eternity of loss, a bridge between the world that was and the void that follows, as the kinetic energy of a trillion-ton spinning rock is converted into heat, sound, and the absolute destruction of everything we have ever loved or built. The sky, once a brilliant blue, turns into a bruised purple and then a terrifying black as the upper layers of the atmosphere are stripped away, allowing the unfiltered radiation of space to kiss the scorched earth for the first time in millions of years, a celestial goodbye to a planet that dared to stand still. As the kinetic energy bleeds into the ground, the very plates we live upon begin to buckle and fold, creating new mountain ranges in seconds and swallowing entire islands in the blink of an eye. A terrestrial reconfiguration that leaves the Earth unrecognizable. This is the price of inertia, a debt paid in the currency of existence, where the momentum of 4 billion years is settled in a single, heart-stopping moment of absolute kinetic reckoning. When the clock finally restarts and the Earth resumes its march through the stars, it will do so as a scarred and broken vessel, carrying only the ghost of a civilization that was too busy looking at the stars to notice the ground beneath its feet was moving at 1,600 kilometers per hour. This is the true law of the universe, that balance is bought with blood, and that every spin must one day come to an end, leaving behind only the cold, starlit silence of a world that has finally, and most terribly, found its peace, its quiet, and its absolute, unwavering stillness. However, as the dust of the first kinetic impact from the previous chapter begins to settle into a gray, supersonic haze, a second, more fluid nightmare awakens from the depths of our world. The global migration of the oceans. To truly comprehend this watery apocalypse, we must first realize that our Earth is not a perfect sphere, but rather an oblate spheroid, a shape maintained solely by the relentless centrifugal force of its 1,000-mile-an-hour spin. This rotation has, for eons, acted as a cosmic shepherd, piling the waters of the world into a massive, shimmering bulge at the equator, standing 8 kilometers higher than it would on a static planet. But now, as the rotation abruptly halts, this invisible shepherd vanishes instantly, and the bulge, this trillion-ton mountain of salt water, is suddenly released from its gravitational prison. Without the outward pull of centrifugal force, the planet's gravity becomes the sole master of the tides, demanding a lethal and inevitable redistribution of every single drop of water on the surface. This is not merely a localized storm surge, but rather a planetary-scale drainage, a silent and unstoppable march of the oceans away from the equator and toward the North and South poles. For instance, in the first few minutes of this transition, coastal cities like Singapore, Quito, and Nairobi witness a sight more terrifying than any tsunami. The ocean simply leaves. The sea retreats for many kilometers, revealing a scarred and alien seabed of long-lost shipwrecks, ancient coral graveyards, and the dark, abyssal mud that has not seen the sun in millions of years. And as the equator dries into a new, jagged supercontinent of salt and bone, the poles begin to face a watery execution. The North and South Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Oceans are no longer separate entities, but have instead become a singular, surging wall of momentum, moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour toward the polar basins. In the Northern Hemisphere, this wall of water swallows the Caribbean, drowns the Gulf Coast of America, and begins its relentless climb over the Appalachian and European highlands. Furthermore, cities like London, Paris, and New York are not just flooded, they are utterly erased, buried under kilometers of freezing salt water as the ocean seeks its new and terrifying equilibrium. The sheer weight of this migrating water is so immense that it begins to physically depress the Earth's crust, triggering secondary tectonic failures and massive underwater landslides that send secondary shockwaves through the very core of the planet. Moreover, think of the displacement of trillions of cubic meters of liquid, moving with the cold, calculated precision of a mathematical equation being solved in real time. As the water drapes itself over the poles, it creates two massive and isolated oceans, leaving a ring of dry, desolate land circling the equator, a new world of twin seas and a central desert. This redistribution of mass alters the very gravitational signature of the Earth, further destabilizing the already wounded atmosphere and creating a feedback loop of climatic chaos that no human has ever survived. The heat generated by the friction of this massive water movement begins to boil the shallower seas, creating a thick and salt-laden fog that blankets the drowning continents in a ghostly, suffocating shroud. And so, we are witnessing the death of the maritime world and the birth of a new, unrecognizable geography, where our maps are rendered as useless as the civilizations they once charted. Every lighthouse, every port, and every memory of the shore is now a silent relic at the bottom of a new polar sea. A testament to the fact that we were only ever guests on a dry land permitted by the grace of a spinning globe. The deep sea currents, which were the conveyor belts of life that regulated our climate for millennia, are now shattered and replaced by violent, vertical surges that bring the freezing, oxygen-poor waters of the abyss to the surface, suffocating what remains of marine life in a tragic, global hypoxia. For example, the Great Barrier Reef would not just die, it would be crushed under the weight of an ocean that has lost its way, while the atmosphere above is whipped into a frenzy as the migrating oceans drag the air with them, creating oceanic winds that carry the salt and spray into the upper layers of the stratosphere, turning the sky into a dim, saline haze that blocks out the sun forever. This is the era of the Great Drowning, a period where the very element that birthed life becomes its primary executioner, proving that in the absolute absence of motion, water always finds its level, even if that level is over the heads of 10 billion people. And as the poles become deep, lightless reservoirs of human history, the equator rises as a barren, salt-encrusted ridge, a skeletal spine of a world that has forgotten how to breathe, leaving us to wonder if the cradle of life was ever meant to stand still. Finally, the hydrostatic pressure at the new poles becomes so extreme, it begins to alter the very chemistry of the seabed, forcing methane clathrates to erupt in massive underwater explosions that further poison the darkening waters. We are left with a planet of two halves, divided by a wall of silence and united only by the memory of a blue world that once knew the rhythm of the tides. This is the finality of the inertial deluge, a reconfiguration of existence where the only certainty is the cold, crushing weight of the deep. It is a slow, agonizing transformation that strips the earth of its familiar blue and green, replacing it with the stark, monochromatic palette of salt and abyss. A world where the only sound is the relentless roar of water, finding its final, frozen resting place at the ends of the world. However, as the crust of our world buckles under the weight of new polar oceans and the echoes of the initial inertial impact fade into a haunting, static-filled silence, a third and perhaps more insidious catastrophe begins to ignite within the very air we once took for granted, which is the total and irreversible collapse of our atmospheric shield. To truly understand this trial by fire, we must realize that the atmosphere is not merely a static envelope of light, but rather a dynamic, swirling ocean of gas that, for 4.5 billion years, has been kept in a delicate, precarious balance by the Earth's relentless and life-giving rotation. This rotation created the Coriolis effect, a planetary steering wheel that organized the winds into predictable, rhythmic patterns, such as the trade winds that guided ancient explorers and the high-altitude jet streams that distributed heat and moisture across the continents. But now, as the spinning heart of the world stands still, the steering wheel is shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the atmosphere, still possessed by its own terrifying and unspent eastward momentum of 1,600 kilometers per hour, begins to tear itself away from the stationary surface below in a violent, invisible decoupling. And in this catastrophic friction generated at the boundary between the unyielding ground and the racing air, a thermal pulse of apocalyptic proportions is born, turning the clear blue sky into a global, incandescent furnace. This is not the familiar, gentle warmth of a summer sun. Instead, it is the searing, white-hot heat of kinetic energy being converted into raw thermal radiation, a process that begins to bake the very oxygen and nitrogen of our world into a glowing shroud of ionized plasma that mirrors the surface of a dying star. For instance, in the upper layers of the stratosphere, where the air is moving so fast that it begins to compress against the resistance of the standstill, The gas is heated to thousands of degrees in a matter of seconds, melting the very clouds and turning the life-giving moisture of our world into a dry, suffocating, and metallic steam. Moreover, as the atmosphere loses its organized, layered structure, the protective ozone layer, that thin chemical veil that has shielded every living thing from the sun's lethal ultraviolet breath, begins to shred and scatter like smoke in a hurricane. Without this fragile shield, the unfiltered, agonizing radiation of the stars begins to kiss the scorched earth for the first time in an eternity. A celestial fire that bleaches the ruins of our cities and sterilizes the soil of any remaining microbial life, leaving the ground as barren as the lunar plains. Think of the atmosphere as a protective, breathing skin that has suddenly been flayed open by the hand of physics, exposing the wounded, naked planet to the cold, indifferent, and hungry vacuum of space. As the global wind patterns collapse into a singular, chaotic, and planet-wide vortex, they drag with them the pulverized remains of our civilization, the dust of our libraries, the glass of our towers, and the ash of our forests, creating dust storms of fire, where the debris acts as fuel for the atmospheric friction, turning the daytime sky into a bruised, sickly purple, and then a terrifying, lightless black that feels like the end of time itself. And beneath this roiling, angry sky, the very chemistry of the air begins to change in ways that defy our understanding. As the intense heat forces the nitrogen to react with oxygen, creating a toxic, acrid cocktail of nitrogen oxides that will eventually rain down as concentrated acid, dissolving the skeletal remains of our skyscrapers and poisoning the newly formed polar oceans in a final chemical insult to the planet. This is the era of the Great Ignition, a period where the air itself becomes a physical enemy, a force of heat and pressure that smothers the memory of the world we once inhabited. The friction at the surface is so intense that it creates what scientists call a thermal boundary layer, a zone of energy that liquefies the top centimeters of the crust, turning the once green plains into vast, shimmering sheets of black volcanic glass that reflect the dying, distorted light of a sun we can no longer see. Furthermore, the magnetic field, that invisible protective shield generated by the spinning liquid iron core deep within, begins to waver, flicker, and fail as the internal geodynamo is disrupted by the sudden, violent halt of the mantle, allowing the relentless solar wind to strip away the lighter gases of our atmosphere, literally bleeding the planet's breath into the vast void of space like a wounded animal gasping for its final air. We are witnessing the total transformation of a garden into a wasteland, a world where the sweet scent of rain is replaced by the metallic, ozonated tang of electrical fire and the acrid, choking stench of burning rock. Every breath taken by those hiding in the deepest, most fortified bunkers would be a desperate struggle against the rising heat and the thinning, oxygen-starved air. A silent and terrifying countdown as the atmosphere we once shared becomes a vanishing luxury reserved for the dead. The clouds, which were once symbols of life, hope, and the promise of rain, have now become the harbingers of acid and fire, moving in erratic, jagged, and nonsensical patterns that defy all meteorological logic, creating supercells of plasma lightning that strike the Earth with the focused power of small suns, leaving behind craters of fused glass. And yet, In the midst of this fiery chaos, there is a strange and terrible beauty, a world illuminated by the glow of its own destruction, where the sky is a canvas of fire and the earth is a mirror of ash. However, as the last of the organized jet streams dissipate into a chaotic thermal haze, the earth is left as a naked, scorched pebble in the dark, a silent witness to the fact that our atmosphere was never a right, but rather a temporary privilege granted by the relentless, life-giving spin of a world that has now, most terribly, come to a rest. The global temperature continues to climb as the greenhouse effect is replaced by a friction effect, a runaway cycle of heat that turns the planet into a pressure cooker, where the moisture from the boiling oceans is trapped beneath a layer of salt haze and ash, creating a suffocating greenhouse of steam that would melt the very soul of the world. For example, the high-altitude flights of the past, the birds that once rode the currents, and the satellites that monitored our weather, all are now gone, replaced by a sky that is too heavy to fly through and too hot to exist within. This is the finality of the failing atmosphere, a reconfiguration of the heavens where the only certainty is the searing, unyielding heat of a world that has forgotten how to shield itself from the cruel gaze of the universe. It is a slow, agonizing suffocation that strips the earth of its blue veil, replacing it with the stark, monochromatic palette of a dying star's furnace. A world where the only sound is the relentless, low-frequency roar of a sky that is literally burning itself out of existence. Finally, as the 5 seconds of standstill end and the planet attempts to find its new, broken rhythm, the atmosphere will remain scarred for millennia, a thin and toxic ghost of the vibrant sky that once protected the cradle of humanity. We are left to ponder the fragility of our existence, realizing that we are but passengers on a rock whose very movement was our only shield against the fire of the stars. This is the legacy of the 3rd chapter, a sky of fire, a breath of ash, and the cold, starlit silence of a world that can no longer protect its own. A world that has finally learned the true cost of standing still in a universe that is always in motion. As the atmosphere remains a searing shroud of ionized fire and the oceans settle into their new, frozen polar reservoirs. From the previous chapters, a far more profound and subterranean violence begins to ripple through the very foundation of our existence, which is the total and catastrophic failure of the Earth's lithosphere. To truly comprehend this tectonic execution, we must first realize that the Earth's crust is not a solid, immovable shell, but rather a complex, multi-layered jigsaw puzzle of massive tectonic plates. The Pacific, the North American, the Eurasian, and others, all floating upon a semi-liquid, plastic-like mantle, and all of which have been precisely tuned for eons to the specific centrifugal stresses of a rotating planet. This rotation, acting as a constant outward pull, imparted an equatorial bulge not just to the liquid water, but to the solid Earth itself, forcing the rocks at the equator to stand roughly 21 kilometers higher than they would on a non-spinning world, a geological fact that defines the very shape of our home. But now, as the kinetic brakes of the universe are slammed shut, that 21-kilometer mountain of solid basalt and granite becomes a structural impossibility, a massive gravitational debt that must be settled through the most violent and widespread seismic readjustment in the history of the solar system. And in this moment of absolute terrifying reckoning, the Earth's crust begins to buckle, fold, and snap like brittle glass under the pressure of a trillion-ton hammer, triggering what geologists would call a global megathrust event, where the internal energy of the planet is released in a single, heart-stopping burst. For instance, along the Pacific Ring of Fire, a 40,000-kilometer arc of intense volcanic and seismic activity, covering an area of over 160 million square kilometers. The subduction zones that once moved by mere millimeters per year are suddenly forced to compensate for the lost momentum of billions of tons of rock in a matter of seconds, releasing elastic strain energy equivalent to a magnitude 12.0 earthquake. A seismic event so powerful it renders the traditional Richter scale obsolete and sends ripples through the very vacuum of space. Moreover, as the planet's oblate shape attempts to collapse back into a perfect resting sphere, the massive basaltic plates of the ocean floor are driven into the continents with supersonic force, creating new, jagged mountain ranges in a single, chaotic afternoon. This is not the slow, majestic process of orogeny that we studied in textbooks. Instead, it is geological surgery performed with the blunt, cold instrument of inertia, where the very soil of places like the American Great Plains, the Eurasian steppe, or the Amazon basin is instantly liquidated into a churning, swallowing sea of mud and stone through a physical process known as continental-scale soil liquefaction, where solid ground behaves like a turbulent liquid under the stress of S-waves. Think of the sheer, raw physics at play as the Earth's massive angular momentum is converted into sheer mechanical stress, fracturing the ancient Precambrian bedrock and sending shock waves, the primary P waves and the secondary S waves traveling through the planet's interior at speeds exceeding 8 kilometers per second, effectively turning the entire globe into a ringing bell of tectonic agony that can be felt in the core itself. And beneath this fractured and bleeding surface, the sudden deceleration disrupts the delicate, liquid flow of the outer core's molten iron, the very geodynamo that generates our protective magnetic field. As the mantle grinds to a halt against the still spinning core, the resulting friction generates subterranean heat so intense it begins to melt the underside of the crust, creating massive plumes of superheated magma that burst through the surface in a global, synchronized volcanic awakening that defies all historical records. For example, dormant and restless giants like the Yellowstone caldera, Mount Fuji, and the Phlegraean fields of Italy are not just triggered. They are literally decapitated by the internal pressure, sending billions of tons of stratospheric ash and sulfurous gases into a sky that is already choking on its own fire and salt. The total surface area affected is absolute all 510 million square kilometers of shifting, cracking, and exploding terrain, where no square inch of the world remains stable or safe, as the tectonic energy bleeds into every fault line and every volcanic vent. Furthermore, as the crustal plates shift violently to fill the void left by the disappearing equatorial bulge, massive grabens and rift valleys, some thousands of kilometers long, open up across the heart of Africa and Asia, swallowing entire mountain ranges and the ruins of ancient civilizations into the glowing, hungry mantle below, where pressures exceed 3 million atmospheres. The chemical composition of the atmosphere is further poisoned as these thousands of new volcanic vents release megatons of sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, and toxic hydrogen sulfide. creating a runaway volcanic winter that will eventually shroud the planet in a darkness deeper and more permanent than any night humanity has ever known. This is the era of the lithospheric fury, a period where the very ground that birthed our species becomes its primary and final grave. A physical manifestation of kinetic energy turned into structural ruin. The sheer density and speed of the tectonic movement create localized gravity anomalies that would cause the very human sense of up and down to waver and fail, as the mass of the planet is redistributed in a chaotic, non-linear fashion across the hemispheres. And so, we are witnessing the final brutal erasure of the Holocene geography, a world where the Himalayas are crushed from within by their own massive weight. The Grand Canyon is fused shut by the incandescent heat of friction, and the Mediterranean Sea is transformed into a jagged, steaming scar of black volcanic glass and obsidian flows. Every bunker, every deep-sea laboratory, and every mountain fortress built by the hands of man is revealed as a fragile, pathetic toy against the raw, indifferent power of a planet reconfiguring its own skeleton to find peace in the stillness. The total energy released during these 5 seconds is so vast, so incomprehensible, that it begins to slow the planet's very cooling process, locking the Earth into a state of geological fever that will last for millions of years to come. A heat that radiates from the rocks like a dying breath from a titan. We must also consider the chemical transformation of the minerals themselves. Under the extreme pressure of the Standstill, common quartz and feldspar are crushed into high-pressure polymorphs like coesite and stishovite, altering the very density of the crustal rock and making the surface brittle and prone to further collapse. This is the finality of the 4th chapter. A world where the rock has lost its long-held memory of stillness and the mountains have forgotten their place in the sky. A world where the very concept of terra firma has become a forgotten myth. It is an agonizing, grinding, and rhythmic transformation that strips the Earth of its familiar, welcoming face, replacing it with the jagged, obsidian features of a primordial wasteland. A world where the only sound is the relentless, low-frequency groan of the crust as it settles into its new, broken, and silent equilibrium. Finally, as the last of the great tectonic plates find their resting place and the lava flows begin to cool into new, alien continents of basalt and ash, the Earth is left as a scarred, volcanic ember drifting in the dark, a silent witness to the fact that our stability was never a permanent state of being, but rather a fleeting and beautiful gift of the very motion that has now, most terribly, come to an absolute rest. We are left to ponder the terrifying scale of our home, realizing that we have always lived on the thin, fragile back of a sleeping giant that has finally, and most violently, woken up to claim its final debt of motion in the starlit silence of the cosmos, leaving only the cold echoes of a civilization that never knew how fast it was truly moving. However, as the 5 seconds of planetary standstill reach their absolute and silent conclusion, the cosmic gears of our solar system engage once more, triggering a catastrophe perhaps even more erratic and devastating than the halt itself. The violent, grinding restart of the Earth's rotation. To truly comprehend this final kinetic execution, we must realize that a planet of 6 sextillion tons does not simply start moving smoothly. Instead, it undergoes a massive, world-shaking lurch as the core and mantle attempt to regain their 1,600 km/h eastward momentum against the dead weight of a broken, static crust. This is the second coming of inertia, a physical retribution moving in the opposite direction, creating a planetary whiplash effect that shatters the already weakened and fractured foundations of the lithosphere. And as the crust begins to accelerate from 0 to 460 meters per second at the equator, every standing structure, every mountain peak, and every skyscraper that somehow survived the initial halt is now subjected to a reverse kinetic load of over 0.3 g of lateral acceleration. Snapping steel reinforcements like dry twigs and pulverizing high-performance concrete into fine gray dust as the ground literally slides out from beneath the ruins. For instance, in the vast, deep basins of the Pacific and Atlantic, covering over 360 million square kilometers, the waters that were migrating toward the poles at supersonic speeds are suddenly yanked eastward by the resuming spin, creating chaotic, multi-directional cross seas where waves 3 to 5 kilometers high collide with the concentrated force of multiple gigaton-level nuclear detonations, turning the global oceans into a frothing, white-hot cauldron of kinetic energy and boiling salt. The sheer friction of water against the rising seabed causes a rapid forced evaporation that leaves behind vast, salt-encrusted plains where vibrant coral reefs once thrived. While the atmosphere, which had been racing eastward during the Standstill, now finds itself being dragged and compressed by the accelerating surface, creating a secondary wave of atmospheric friction that generates a temperature surge in the troposphere reaching up to 800 degrees Celsius, turning the clear sky into a shimmering, incandescent shroud of heat. Think of the sheer physical trauma as the Earth's massive angular momentum is forcefully restored. A process that sends deep, resonant earth hums through the inner core, a low-frequency infrasound of groaning metal and screaming stone at 7 to 14 hertz that would be audible even in the dark vacuum of space. And beneath the surface, the liquid iron outer core. The planetary geodynamo is thrown into a state of total fluid dynamic chaos as the mantle begins to spin faster than the liquid core can compensate, causing the magnetic field lines, which were already wavering, to undergo a violent magnetic snap that leads to localized pole reversals and a total, terrifying breakdown of the magnetosphere, dropping its strength to nearly 0 in seconds and allowing the high-energy solar wind to pour directly into the lower atmosphere, creating auroras not just at the poles, but over every square inch of the scorched equator. A sky of dancing, lethal neon lights produced by the violent excitation of the air itself. Furthermore, the geological readjustment from a perfect sphere back to an oblate spheroid, a massive difference of 21.3 kilometers in equatorial radius, is not a gentle settling, but a series of tectonic shudders that triggers secondary volcanic eruptions from the newly opened rift valleys in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, covering an area of over 300 million square kilometers with fresh, superheated lava. The sky is now flooded with pressurized steam and volcanic ash, creating a permanent, gray, global shroud that blocks out 99% of all life-giving sunlight, marking the era of the violent restart as a period where the planet is reborn in fire, steam, and motion, but at a cost that renders the previous 12,000 years of human history a forgotten, impossible dream. For example, The ancient continental shelves are now jagged cliffs of raw bedrock, and great river systems like the Amazon, which once discharged hundreds of thousands of cubic meters per second, have been diverted into massive, glowing lava tubes or swallowed by the new rift valleys. While the sudden increase in centrifugal pressure at the equator forces the newly liquefied crust to bulge outward once again, creating massive gravity waves that would flatten any remaining land masses into a smooth, featureless plain of volcanic silt and black obsidian glass. Under this extreme pressure, the very ground we once walked upon is crushed and reformed, and every memory of human achievement, every city, every digital record, and every work of art has been washed away by water or buried under kilometers of new rock, leaving only the cold, starlit silence of a world that has finally paid its absolute debt to the laws of motion. And so, as the Earth finally settles back into its familiar, ancient 24-hour rhythm, it is no longer the blue marble we once called home. Instead, it is a bruised, gray, and scarred entity. Its geography permanently altered into a monochromatic wasteland of basalt, salt, and ash, where the oxygen we breathe is now a rare, metallic-tasting luxury, and the stars above are hidden behind a veil of ash that may not clear for 1,000 generations. Finally, we are left to realize that our survival was never guaranteed by our intelligence, our cities, or our technology, but rather by the silent, relentless, and fragile stability of a spinning rock in the dark. For the violent restart is the final, crushing signature of a universe that does not care for the still or the small. A world that has learned that to stand still, even for 5 seconds, is to invite the total and absolute reset of existence itself, leaving only the cold echoes of a civilization that never knew how fast it was truly moving. And so, as the violent, earth-shaking echoes of the restart finally fade into the cold, starlit silence of the cosmos, we find ourselves gazing upon a world that no longer remembers our names, our grand empires, or our deepest, most desperate ambitions. The deep, jagged scars etched across the Earth's surface, the vast, ethereal salt flats where mighty oceans once teemed with diverse life, the endless, glass-like obsidian plains of cooling lava, and the silent, ash-choked canyons that whisper of a lost world, now stand as a final, unyielding monument to the absolute and indifferent authority of the laws of physics. We have spent millennia erroneously thinking of the solid ground beneath our feet as an eternal, unmoving stage for our history. Yet in truth, we have always been fragile, fleeting passengers on a blue marble, hurtling through the infinite, predatory dark at speeds that defy the reach of human imagination, moving at over 107,000 kilometers per hour around a star that is itself racing through a galaxy of 100 billion suns at 800,000 kilometers per hour. Those 5 seconds of total, absolute stillness were not merely a pause in time. They were a profound and terrifying revelation. A reminder that every city we built with pride, every memory we cherished in our hearts, and every single, delicate breath we took depended entirely on the relentless, silent momentum of a spinning rock dancing in the void. We must realize that even in our deepest sleep, we are travelers of the vacuum, tethered to this sphere by nothing more than the invisible curvature of space-time and the ancient, persistent ghost of angular momentum. Moreover, as we look at the bruised and beautiful horizon, where the sun now rises over a landscape of basalt and ash. We must contemplate the profound irony of our long-forgotten existence, that the very forces we might have feared if we had understood them, the centrifugal bulge that shaped our continents, the lurching inertia of the mantle, and the invisible friction of the atmosphere were, in fact, the silent and perfect guardians of our daily stability, the unseen cradle that kept the chaos of the universe at bay. In the grand, indifferent mechanics of the universe, there is no such thing as true stillness. There is only the delicate, precarious balance between constant, rhythmic motion and total, irreversible catastrophe. A cosmic dance where every atom within our bodies is in a state of eternal, vibrating unrest, echoing the spin of the planet itself. We have learned, at the ultimate and most tragic cost, that a sudden silence can be more destructive than the loudest storm, and that the simple, unnoticed act of the Earth turning on its axis is a miracle of cosmic engineering that we took for granted every single sunrise, every single hour of our fleeting lives. The planet does not owe us its movement. It provides it as a silent gift, a byproduct of the violent birth of our solar system 4.5 billion years ago, a legacy of dust and fire that has finally found its rhythm once more. Finally, as the gray shroud of volcanic ash begins its slow, thousand-year descent back to the healing soil, and the distant stars begin to twinkle once more through the thinning toxic haze, we are forced to realize that the Earth does not need us to keep spinning, nor does it require our presence to find its place in the celestial harmony of the spheres. The planet will eventually heal its own deep wounds through the slow, patient processes of geological deep time. Its ancient scars will be buried under new, silent layers of stone. And a new, cold equilibrium will be found in the starlit silence of the solar system, where the wind will carry no voices, and the rain will wash away the last traces of our presence. But for those who might remain only as fragments of memory locked within the cooling rock, the lesson remains written forever in the silent dust of our fallen cities. That life is a fleeting gift, granted only by the grace of motion, a momentary spark in the dark, and that in the face of the infinite, we are but whispers lost in a cosmic gale. As you close your eyes now and feel the subtle rhythmic pulse of the planet beneath you, as you feel the weight of your own body resting on a world that is once again moving at 1,600 kilometers per hour, let yourself feel the connection between your own heartbeat and the rotation of the world, a synchronized pulse of life and physics. Let yourself remember that we are still moving, still spinning, and still held in the fragile, beautiful balance of a world that never truly stops. A world that continues its eternal voyage through the abyss long after the last heart has ceased to beat, and the last echo of our civilization has vanished into the star-drenched night.